Chronic fatigue is one of the most common hidden disabilities, and living with it can be very complicated. Today, I want to talk a little more about that. Hi, I'm Sally Riggs, psychologist, fellow long hauler, and your long COVID coach. So, what causes chronic fatigue? That is somewhat of a million-dollar question, and we don't have a complete, precise answer. But based on where science is at now, it is somewhat of an interaction between the nervous system stuff that you may have heard me talking about before, and some dysfunctions in the basic functioning of our cells that create energy and are therefore, as a result of being compromised, struggle to create the amount of energy that we need. You may have heard the word mitochondria, and this is taking me a long way back. I haven't done biology since I was in high school, but they are inside our cells. Every cell in the body has its own mitochondria, and what they are doing is taking the food and drink that we eat and breaking it down into energy, which is this thing called ATP. And what happens in both long COVID and ME/CFS, both of which have, the possibility for this chronic fatigue diagnosis, that the mitochondria are not doing that process correctly. Something in that sequence is interrupted. And so the amount of ATP or energy that is put out is much, much, much smaller. And unlike everybody else, it doesn't replenish as quickly throughout the day. So if you wake up in the morning, you probably don't have as much energy as everybody else because your mitochondria haven't produced enough. And then if you use that all up by, say, 10 o'clock, it doesn't magically recreate more. Also, you probably have heard me talk about before nervous system dysfunction, and this is happening both in long COVID and in ME/CFS. And if we think about the polyvagal ladder, you've got your rest and digest at the top, you've got your fight or flight in the middle, and you've got your shutdown at the bottom. That shutdown is chronic fatigue. Anybody who has experienced chronic fatigue will describe to you that pervasive heaviness in the body, and that is very much what we experience when our body shuts down. And you might be thinking, wait a second, what is this shutdown thing, and how do I get into this shutdown? And primarily what is happening, due to vagus nerve damage, we go into this extended fight or flight reaction. And that is actually not sustainable in the body, and could cause serious damage if it goes on for an extended period of time. And so the body has this third nervous system mechanism, which is like a ripcord, and it just shuts everything down. And that is what we sometimes call immobilization or dorsal vagal or shutdown. And that really is chronic fatigue. If you're not quite sure about how this is working in your body, I do have a wonderful video that talks about the different sensations that we have in each of the nervous system states and how to tell which state that you're in. And I'm going to link to that up here. And one more important thing to say about shutdown, all of the nervous system states are functional. And shutdown is very much there as a protective mode to keep us safe from the damage that would happen if we were in fight or flight extensively. However, anybody who's ever lived with chronic fatigue knows that it doesn't feel protective and it doesn't feel functional. It feels very uncomfortable. So living with chronic fatigue is certainly very complicated. It is a hidden disability, so people cannot see that you have chronic fatigue, and so the rest of the world is likely to look at you and think there's nothing wrong with this person, particularly those of us who on the outside seemingly are young and healthy, whatever that means. It does leave us vulnerable to a lot of misunderstanding from other people, which can also unfortunately lead to abuse. Also, the medical community has very badly misunderstood chronic fatigue for decades. And as a result, it can get associated with what we call somaticizing, which is a posh way of saying making something up, or some sort of psychological manifestation. Very frequently, people go to get medical support and are told it's just depression, it's just anxiety, as if those things were not a big deal. But it isn't depression or anxiety. It is a physical, biological process in your body. So the possibility of gaslighting is endless, from friends, from family, from the medical community, and that can also take its toll on us. The other difficulty about living with chronic fatigue is that it is almost impossible to predict when you wake up in the morning how much energy or ATP you actually have, and therefore how much of your day you can actually successfully get done. And so it becomes a constant sort of juggling, guesstimating act around what we often refer to as spoons. And if you want to know more about that, I have another video that I will link to here. How many spoons you have for that day, what you can do with them, how far they're going to go, and then also balancing that with rest, and this thing that we call pacing, which is really just sort of thinking about how much energy you have and how to allocate it. And the example that comes to mind, which again, all of us have lived, we get invited to a social event, maybe somebody's birthday or other type of celebration. And in order to have the energy to go, because we want to go and we want to support our friends and family, we probably have to spend a week in advance resting, canceling all of our normal day-to-day activities so that we can make sure that our mitochondria have created enough energy to get us through whatever the social event is. And then afterwards, as a result of probably not quite getting that energy equation right, we then also more than likely will have to rest for another week or even more to recover from the exertion of that activity. And the difficulty with that is that nobody sees those buffers either side. And so we show up at the party or whatever it is, and people say, "Oh, you look great," because we've used some of our precious energy to put on makeup and find a nice outfit and do our hair. And that further perpetuates this idea that there's nothing wrong with us. And I personally lived it too. You know, people will say to you, "Well, why don't you just go out looking like that?" Personally, I really struggle with going out just looking like that. That isn't who I am, and that isn't what I do. And so, yeah, when I was really bad with chronic fatigue in 2021, whenever I would meet someone, even for brunch on a Saturday, I would spend hours finding an outfit, getting dressed, putting on makeup. And time and again, they would say to me, "Oh, you look great." And then you die a little bit on the inside when you hear that. Another very common situation, many people with chronic fatigue do use mobility aids. And that may be a wheelchair, it may be a walker, it may be a walking stick, it may be something else. And of course, that use is going to vary day to day depending on how much energy we have and what type of activity we're being asked to do. And oftentimes, particularly around the wheelchair use, this word ambulatory is used. People who use a wheelchair but can actually stand or walk for short periods potentially, as opposed to non-ambulatory, which are people who cannot walk or stand and are permanently either in the wheelchair or need assistance to move from other people or from a hoist, etc. And of course, in the non-disability community, there is a lot of confusion around that. And when somebody sees an ambulatory wheelchair user, it's very easy to conclude that this person doesn't need a wheelchair and is faking it. And in fact, recently, there was a well-known travel influencer, I guess is the word, who has a podcast and was talking about how people use wheelchairs at the airport and use that very much phraseology, that people are faking it because they can actually walk. And this lack of understanding around how chronic fatigue works and how we are reliant on these supports, and they make such a huge difference to our functioning and quality of life. Even though I am 95% recovered from long COVID, I do still use a wheelchair at the airport, and that is because airports are big. And if I use my energy to walk from one end of the airport to the other with my carry-on suitcase, which is basically carrying something, I would use up my entire week's energy and then not be able to enjoy the destination I'm going to, have a swim, maybe do some weights, maybe have a small walk with some running intervals in it. And so I utilize the wheelchair at the airport in that way because it affords me the quality of life I want. And anybody with this type of hidden disability is fully within their rights to do that. And the bottom line living with chronic fatigue is that you don't get to live the life that you want anymore. It has been taken away from you, and that is enormously frustrating. So what should you do if you have chronic fatigue? Well, first and foremost, you definitely need to think about resting, you need to think about pacing, and you need to learn about mitochondrial supports. And when I say mitochondrial supports, there are a few things, supplements, medications, etc., that have been shown through science to be supporting our mitochondria in their functioning. Sadly, at this point, we don't have a cure for what's happening in that sequence that has been interrupted, but we do have a few things that seem to make it better. So starting with prescription end of the scale, low-dose naltrexone has been used now for decades, and this is actually a medication. Naltrexone is used in substance abuse and addictions, but this is something that is used at a much lower dose, and my rudimentary understanding of how it works, coming from the addictions world, is that it blocks certain receptors in the brain. And interestingly, that also allows you to feel better with your energy. And that may sound strange, and let me see if I can explain it a little better. If your body is not naturally getting a certain neurotransmitter as frequently as it was, then it may be encouraged to produce more of it internally, and that can enhance your energy levels. So used in very low doses, definitely need to have a prescriber that you're working with, definitely need to start on a very low dose and taper up very gradually, but can be enormously beneficial, and certainly I have taken that and it has been beneficial to my recovery. Other end of the spectrum is things that we can just get off of Amazon. And the easiest one of those is D-ribose. And D-ribose is kind of a sort of form of sugar. And so it is literally just giving us energy in the body. Now, some people respond really well to D-ribose, almost to the point where they feel hyper. Other people, and I'm more in that category, don't really notice much of a difference. But it's definitely worth trying, because if you do wind up being in the category that you respond well to it, that's going to be great for you. There's another thing that you can buy from Amazon, although it is slightly more complicated in terms of it's closer to a prescription medication, which is a thing called methylene blue. And methylene blue actually is one of the components of the sequence in that mitochondrial reaction. And so if we take it, it essentially helps the mitochondria to do what they're doing and spitting out more energy. And I personally have taken it and had a very good response to it. However, one thing you need to be mindful of is that it does create a lot of serotonin in the body. If you are already taking another medication that creates a lot of serotonin in the body, like, for example, an SSRI, you will want to talk with your physician, because if you have too much serotonin in the body, you're going to get serotonin syndrome, which is very nasty. You can look up on Google what those side effects are, but you definitely don't want that. So if you can take methylene blue, it will be very beneficial to you. However, double check with your physician. Do not get serotonin syndrome. Be very careful on the dosages. It is dependent on body weight. And also a very important tip, you can spread it out through the day, but do not take too much in the evening because you will have insomnia as a result of it. So most of us tend to take more in the morning, a little bit at lunch, and then maybe a teeny bit with dinner so that you don't get super wired and struggle to sleep. And then the most important thing, in addition to all of this, is learning and befriending your nervous system. If you can help your body not to be in that extended fight or flight, not to keep crashing down into shutdown, you will not be experiencing that chronic fatigue anymore. And I have numerous videos on this channel and in all my other resources that help you learn your nervous system, befriend your nervous system, calm your nervous system, and enormously reduce that process. So, if you have chronic fatigue, or you suspect that you have chronic fatigue, and you want to know whether that might be part of a long COVID diagnosis, obviously, one important thing is to know whether you have had a COVID infection. If your chronic fatigue started in 2015, probably that isn't part of long COVID because COVID wasn't around until 2019. But of course, many of us also don't know whether we had COVID. We might have been asymptomatic. We might not have had access to testing. And so I do have on my website a questionnaire, which is based on a Delphi study. And a Delphi study is where you get a group of experts together and they come up with a consensus list of symptoms that would give you a definitive diagnosis. And in this case, if you take a look at the checklist on my website, if you have one of any of the things on there, you more than likely do have long COVID. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a tolerable week. I'll see you again soon.